Hey, what is up guys? It's Stan here back with another video. So you finally decided this is the year you're going to be upgrading to that brand new iPad or iPhone. And you're already ready to go. You're at that order screen with your credit card in hand, ready to make that order. But then you're second guessing yourself because is 128 gigs really enough? Should I upgrade to that 256? Or should I even splurge and go all the way to 512 or even 1 terabyte? Well, in this video, I want to talk about how much space do you really need on an iPad and give you some use scenarios and go through some numbers. And then at the very end, I'll give you some tips and tricks on how to decrease your overall usage and some alternatives. So let's get into it. So this is the brand new 2020 iPad in a 512 gig configuration. I actually did a full unboxing of it, so if you want to check that out, you can take a look at the link in the description down below and see that video. But for this video, we'll take a look at how I decided that I needed 512 gigs for this iPad. So in deciding how much capacity you really need, you may already have an iPhone or you may already have an iPad, and the easiest way to see how much space you need is to take a look at existing capacity or usage of your old devices. To do that, just go into your settings and then go into general and then about. And then in here, you can take a look at how many songs you have, what is the capacity left over. So for me, I've got 1,200 songs, 233 songs, 400 videos, 24,000 photos, and as you can see, a capacity of 512 with about 300 gigs available. So that means I've used about 210 gigs or so, about 45% or give or take. So as you can see here, I've already used up almost half of the capacity of the iPad. And depending on, you might be more song heavy or photo heavy or whatnot, you may want to take a look at your overall usage. And from there, we can take a look at, if you go back to general and then go down to iPad storage here, you'll have an even better breakdown of how much capacity or usage you have. If you don't have an iPad, for example, you can take a look at my numbers. So I have about 169 gigs of photos for that 24,000 photos, which roughly translates to be about 7 megabytes per photo. Now, I know I have a lot of photos that go back to almost 15 or so years, all in the photo library. I've been using iPhoto, Aperture, and now Apple Photos on my Mac, and it's all in there. So perhaps you may not have that many photos, but then if you have more videos or whatnot, that might cause you to have a very big photo library. Now, the second most consumption on the iPad for me is Netflix. And as you can see here, it takes about 15 gigabytes of storage. Now, why does Netflix take up so much storage? Well, you have the capability to download shows directly onto your iPad so that you can view them offline. And this may come as a surprise, but the shows actually take up a lot of space. So for me, I've got 2 seasons or 2 shows downloaded to the iPad. I've got The Witcher and Altered Carbon, the entire season. And as you can see here, most of the episodes range around 800 to a gigabyte per episode. So as you can see, 16 episodes, that's about 15 or so gigs. And when you add them up, if you have multiple shows or whatever, that can balloon to 20, 30, 40 gigabytes of storage required just for Netflix alone. Now, if you have Disney Plus or if you do any other streaming shows that you can allow you to download offline, it'll probably be around in the 1 gigabyte per episode size as well. That's something to keep in mind of. Next on my list, I've got music. And as I said before, I've got 1,200 songs on this iPad. Now, I know there's a lot of people with 20,000, 30,000 songs. I've actually got a relatively small number of songs, or a relatively low number of songs downloaded to the iPad. And as you can see here, it's only about 10 or so gigs, or 9.5 gigs. So for me, it's actually a relatively small amount. Next on this list, if you remember, I've got about 400 or so videos or whatever. Some of those videos were downloaded videos from YouTube, and I stuck it in here, and that's where it shows up on the TV app as home videos. Only 5 gigs, and then everything else below that is less than 1 gig. iMessage uses only about 700 megs, and then you have a smattering of other applications, iMovie, Keynote pages. I really don't use those, but they all take up a little bit of space. So for me, as a review, I've got 170 gigs in photos, 15 gigs in Netflix, and then 10 gigs in music. That makes up the majority of that 218 gigs that you can see here that I've used up on the iPad. And again, your usage is going to be completely different from me, but if you already have an iPad, you can take a look at your breakdown to see exactly how much you used and how much space you got left over. Next, let's talk about a couple of usage scenarios for this iPad that may consume a lot of space. If you have a lot of apps on your iPad, I personally don't, but if you do, that's going to take up space. And apps can range anywhere from a couple hundred megabytes all the way up to a couple gigabytes. Especially if you play a lot of games on your iPad, that's going to take up a lot of space. Because let's take a look at just some of the more popular games. If I go into games here on the Apple Store, first hit, Hearthstone. So Hearthstone takes up 1.9 gigs. Let's take a look at another one. So World of Tanks Blitz MMO, this is 2.3 gigs. What else? PUBG Mobile, 2.5 gigs. So as you can see, if you got maybe 3 or 4 or maybe 5 games, that might be 10, 12, 15 gigs, especially if you have some of the more full-featured games on your iPad. Of course, on the other spectrum, Paradise Island 2, this is more of like an iPhone game or something a little bit smaller, only 400 megs. So as you can see, you got just something to think about. If you play a lot of games, that might consume a lot of capacity on your iPad. You can see here that my apps have just very basic apps, some productivity, some shopping apps, and some gaming, Twitch, Discord, whatever. But then I don't actually have that many things installed on this iPad just yet. Again, this is a brand new iPad. I've only had it for about a month or so now, so I haven't had that much time to accumulate all the apps on this iPad. Now, as you can see here, I'm using about 42% of my capacity on this iPad here. I certainly splurged and got the 512 because I knew I had a lot of stuff on here already, about 200 or so gigabytes, and I wanted to have that extra capacity and not feel constrained. But if you're on a budget here, and this is something to think about, because if you take a look at the iPad, the 11-inch iPad Pro here, the 128 gig costs right around $800, and to upgrade to the 256, which adds another 128 gigs, is $100, and then to upgrade to the 512 is $200, and to upgrade to the 1 terabyte is another $200. So you're basically talking about a $500 difference between the base level and the max level for the capacity for this iPad. So you may be saying to yourself, I don't want to spend all that money on the internal storage of the iPad. I'm just going to buy what I can buy, and then I'm going to cut down on what I store on the iPad. Well, there's actually a couple tips and tricks you can do to make your experience a little bit better. One option is to rely on the iCloud integration you have with the iPad. And what I mean by that is every Apple ID account is given 5 gigs of iCloud storage for free. But then for 99 cents, you can upgrade to 50 gigs, or for $3 a month, you can upgrade to 200 gigs of iCloud storage. And for a little bit of cost, that's a lot of storage on iCloud. And what you can do with this iCloud is if you go into General here, and you go to storage, iPad storage again, you can see here you have the option to offload things from the iPad back to the cloud. So for me, I have a 2 terabyte storage pool that I share with my family, and we all dip into that storage capacity. And on this iPad here, you can see I can actually optimize photos, meaning remove most of the photos down to very small resolution thumbnails and keep all the rest of the photos in the cloud. And only when I click on it, it'll download the full photo. So basically, it's having your entire photo library in the iCloud, cloud, and that way I can save 156 gigabytes of storage, having all the photos in the cloud, but then being able to click and download them on the fly and view them on the fly in Photos. Now, you have to realize here, if you were to ever lose internet connection, then you're stuck with the small thumbnails or the low resolution photos. There are some downsides to that for optimizing your photos. You never truly lose the good quality of the photos, but if you were ever to have a hiccup in connection or you go somewhere without internet or Wi-Fi, then you're stuck until you're connected back to the internet again. So there's that. For me, I actually have, the reason why I have so much storage used up by Photos is I've downloaded my entire library onto the iPad, not using this feature because I want my photos with me at all times, and that's why I also upgraded to the higher capacity. Similarly, you can offload apps from the iPad that you don't use, and it's telling me I've got about 5.5 gigs of apps that I rarely use that's stored on this iPad that I can just delete or offload, meaning it'll download them. I can re-download them whenever I want if I were to ever use those apps. And as you can see here, the third option, review downloaded videos, if you click on that, you basically get an option that tells you exactly how many videos and files that you've downloaded that you could probably purge if you've watched it already. So between 14.5 gigs, 5.5 gigs, and 56 gigs, that's a sizable chunk of storage out of the 218 total that the iPad is telling me that I could probably purge and get back down to a much lower capacity. Now, if you have a very, very big music library, you can either only sync a handful of songs over, or if you subscribe to Apple Music or iTunes Match, you can choose to only download a handful of songs but having the rest of your library up in the cloud. I also subscribe to iTunes or Apple Music, and that's why I only have 122 songs on this iPad. The rest of my couple thousand other songs, whatever, are in the cloud, so I can stream or I can download at will and remove the downloads whenever I want. And so that's also another option to be able to cut down on storage on the iPad. If we crunch the numbers here, you can see that $1 per month gives you 50 gigs of storage in the iCloud, or $12 a year. And then if you upgrade to the 200 gig capacity, it's $3 per month, or $36 per year. For $36 for that 200 gigs, you can offload to the cloud. And then you compare it to the 512 versus the 256 version of the iPad. That's $200 for that extra 200 or so gigs of internal storage versus $36 of storage in the cloud. If iCloud offloading works for you, that's certainly a much cheaper option, something to consider. And if you really like Apple Music, and if Apple Music is your thing, then for, I think it's like $10 a month per person or $15 per month for a family, you get to have all your songs in the cloud and stream and download and whatnot, so you can keep that internal storage low on the iPad. That's a little bit more expensive, $10 a month, $120 a year, but still, if you have a huge library, so it's still a little cheaper upgrading from the 256 to 512 gig for I think what, $200 we said earlier. Just something to think about. There's many different ways of doing this, and basically it really depends on how much capacity, how much storage you want, internal storage. Now, of course, as I said before, if you do use the iCloud offloading, or you have Apple Music, if you were to ever lose internet, or let's say you're on an airplane, and you don't have internet connection, well then you don't have access to those files. So for me personally, that's why I went with the 512 version, to have everything at the full resolution, everything on the iPad, because I use this on the go. But you know, your usage may vary. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how much capacity you may actually require on either your iPad or iPhone. Again, take a look at your own usage scenarios, how much you're actually using right now, how much do you think you're going to be using, and then play around with some of the numbers, some of the costs, and perhaps you can come up with a conclusion on how big of an iPad capacity you really need. All things considered though, if you're still worried about capacity, running out of space, and I had that capacity anxiety, just upgrade to the bigger tier. You know, bigger is better. There's really no downsides of having more space on the iPad, especially if you're going to be losing sleep over it. Hopefully this video was useful. I'll see you in the next one.